his time. Habakkuk was probably writing sometime between 608 and 598 BC. There had been a faithful king in the land of Judah by the name of Josiah. If you remember the book of Kings and kind of your Old Testament history, Josiah it was under his reign that they rediscovered the book of the law. And when he read the Old Testament law, he wept because he understood accurately what was taking place in his country was a result of divine judgment and discipline because of their unfaithfulness to the covenant that they made with Yahweh, their God. And so he brought about a number of reforms. Jehoiakim was very unfaithful. And so I think that, Jehoahaz was there, and then the king of Egypt came up and conquered and reestablished a different king. But I think in that his nation, that there is wickedness and evil in the nation. And so he is going to cry out to God. And overall, the response that he's going to get, he's not really going to like at first. Because you can see from the theme at the top of the page that the overall theme of this book is that there's going to be judgment on Judah. What God says in response, and you can see there in the purpose, it's to describe the judgment to come upon Judah through the wicked Babylonians or Chaldeans, and to encourage the righteous to live by faith as they wait for Yahweh to bring their ultimate salvation. You have the author and date there that I've already described, and the book kind of breaks down into two big sections. Habakkuk's perplexities are in chapters 1 and 2, and then Habakkuk's prayer is in chapter 3. And if you look at the beginning of the book, and we basically have time to move through this rather quickly, but verse 1, the oracle which Habakkuk the prophet beheld, how long, O Yahweh, will I call for help? And you will not hear. I cry out to you, violence, and yet you do not save. Why do you make me see wickedness and cause me to look on trouble? Indeed, devastation and violence are before me, and there is strife and contention is lifted up. Therefore the law is ignored, and justice never comes forth. For the wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes forth perverted. And so we are not the first ones to lament the decline of our nation. This is something that has happened throughout the course of history, and Habakkuk is doing exactly that here with this lament to God and this complaint. And in God's response in verses 5 through 11, what he's going to say is that, oh, don't worry, I am going to handle this situation, and I am going to bring judgment, but I'm going to do it through the Chaldeans. I'm going to do it through the Babylonians, right? It's like God saying, if we were to be crying out to God, look at the wickedness in our lands, and God says, don't worry, I'm going to send the Canadians. They're going to bring judgment, and they'll sweep through the land and conquer and judge. And a couple things to note concerning Yahweh's response, that he's going to use the Babylonians. In verse 7, it says, they are dreaded and feared, and their justice and their exaltation come forth from themselves. And then in verse 11, then they will sweep through like the wind and pass on, and they will be held guilty, those whose power is their God. And so you see the Babylonians kind of do their own thing. Might is right. Whatever they can do, they will do. And they worship strength, and they come forth and they bring justice according to their own notions and ideas. And they're building upon human wisdom and human strength. And so you can imagine when Habakkuk hears this, like, that's not the answer that I wanted, God. So there's a second complaint from Habakkuk and a second response from God, beginning in chapter 1, verse 12. And I'd like to read it because this is where you get to the core question that's going to be answered and addressed in this book. Habakkuk, beginning in verse 12, he says, are you not from everlasting? O Yahweh, my God, my Holy One, we will not die. You, O Yahweh, have placed them to judge. And you, O Rock, have established them to reprove. Your eyes are too pure to see evil, and you cannot look on trouble. And why do you look on those who deal treacherously? And here's this key question. Why are you silent when the wicked swallow up those more righteous than they? And you have made men like the fish of the sea, like creeping things without a ruler over them. The Chaldeans bring all of them up with a hook and drag them away in their net and gather them together in their fishing net. Therefore they are glad and rejoice. And so he portrays the Chaldeans, in essence, being fishers of men, but in a different way than evangelism. He says they are capturing them in a net and taking them off to be killed and to be enslaved. But that question at the end of verse 13, that is a big question to wrestle with, right? Why do you allow the righteous to be devoured, consumed, swallowed up by those who are less righteous? Why do you allow the wicked to prosper over the righteous? And that question at the end of Habakkuk's response, it goes from chapter 1, verse 12, and then chapter 2, verse 1. He says, I will stand on my guard post and station myself on the fortification, and I will keep watch to see what he will speak to me and how I may respond when I am reproved. So Habakkuk expects that he's going to get some correction, kind of knows that his response isn't right, but he also says, I'm just going to stand here and wait. And there's an attitude that, God, you need to answer to me concerning this. And then we're going to have a second response from God beginning in chapter 2, verse 2, and it's going to go through the end of that chapter. And just beginning in verse 2, we'll read the first few verses. Then Yahweh answered me and said, write down the vision and write it on tablets distinctly, that the one who reads it may run. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. It pants towards its end, and it will not lie. And though it tarries, wait for it will certainly come. It will not delay. Verse 4, behold, as for the proud one, his soul is not right within him. But the righteous, or the righteous one, will live by his faith. And that little statement right there, as God is is responding to Habakkuk and clarifying what is about to happen. He's making a contrast, right? That the one who is proud, his soul is not right, and the implication is there will be judgment coming upon him. But that little statement, the righteous will live by his faith, or the righteous will live by his faithfulness. Again, that's the thesis statement for the entire book of Romans. If you keep your finger here and go to Romans chapter 1. Romans 1:16, for I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, but the righteous will live by faith. And then that's going to be quoted again in Galatians chapter 3, verse 11. I'm going to turn there real quick and read that to you. You can turn there if you would like. Beginning in verse 10, for as many as are of the works of the law are under a curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law to do them. Now that no one is justified by the law before God is evident. So think about this, to build his case that justification is by faith alone. He says what Habakkuk wrote, that the righteous shall live by faith. And he says that is evidence against the fact that for the fact that nobody will ever be justified by works of the law. And if you go back to Habakkuk, the emphasis here is not even just on a one-time event, This isn't just a mere, well, if you have faith one time, then you will live at this point of judgment. But the reality is that faith is intended to be a way of life. The one who will continue to live by his faith is the one who will be righteous before God. And so this little statement is going to build much more theology later on. And that's kind of fitting the pattern that we've already seen and established, that from the very beginning, Moses, the first author of Scripture, what he's going to write is then going to be built upon, kind of laying it down another additional foundation, and then built up on by the later prophets. And then the apostles are going to pick up right where the prophets left off and continue to build upon previous Scripture and adding some nuance and some clarification. But everything that the Apostle Paul is going to say in the book of Romans is building upon that single statement from Habakkuk. And then, so he's going to kind of introduce this theme and this contrast in verses 4 and 5, that the proud are going to be judged. They are not right with God, but the righteous will live by faith. And then in verses 6 through 20, there's going to be 5 woes. And these woes are really going to be spoken against the Chaldeans. So when God, how can you let the wicked consume those who are more righteous than they? God says, oh, don't worry. I'm going to also bring judgment upon the Chaldeans. The Babylonians, who are going to be used to judge Judah because of Judah's wickedness, they will also be eventually judged by the Persians. And they will be crushed. But there's going to be these 5 woes that are spoken against the Babylonians. And it's very interesting of what all is laid out, because there's going to be a couple different themes here that pick up, again, things that we've already seen in the minor prophets. One thing that stood out to me was in verses 9 through 11. He's, again, speaking against the Babylonians, or the Chaldeans. He says, woe to him who is greedy for evil gain, for his house to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of evil. And you have counseled a shameful thing for your house, by cutting off many people, so you are sinning against your own soul. So he's speaking to the Babylonians and saying, hey, judgment is going to come because you've gone around and destroyed the homes and consumed other people, and you've been striving to build up your own security and safety in your own house. But then notice verse 11. Surely the stone will cry out from the wall, and the rafter will answer it from the framework. Okay, and what does that bring to mind? Where else have we heard the stone will cry out? Turn over to Luke chapter 19, verse 40. And this is where looking up cross-references is a powerful thing. And sometimes we need to write certain cross-references because they're not already printed in our Bibles, or just the ones that are there. If we look them up, we would begin to make a lot of connections in the Scriptures. So Luke chapter 19, Jesus is going to probably cite this in verse 40, but let's zoom out and get the context. So this is the triumphal entry, verse 37. As soon as he was approaching near the descent of the Mount of Olives, the whole multitude of the disciples began to praise God, rejoicing with a loud voice for all the miracles which they had seen, saying, blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord. Peace in heaven and glory in the highest. And some of the Pharisees in the crowd said to him, Teacher, rebuke your disciples. But Jesus answered and said, I tell you, if these were silent, the stones will cry out. And yes, the implication is that Jesus will get the glory and the praise that is due to him. But I also think this is an additional indictment against the Pharisees in the same way that he was condemning the Chaldeans back in Habakkuk. That they have sought to build up a house for themselves and they want safety. Why was Jesus crucified ultimately? Remember the words of Caiaphas in John? It's better that one man should die for the nation than for the whole nation to be crushed by Rome, because they thought Jesus would lead an insurrection and the Romans would come in and crush them all. And so he said, hey, if we just crush Jesus, then the Romans won't crush us. What's that motivation? It's exactly what we see here in Habakkuk, seeking to establish and build a house for themselves where they are secure and high up. The Pharisees and the Sadducees wanted the status quo to be maintained, and Jesus is crying out against them and saying the stones will cry out against them. So there's a lot there within even some of these woes. The next round of 3 verses 12 to 14, is going to conclude with the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh. And that's going to be a theme later on with the day of the Lord, as we're going to see in Zephaniah. And it's, again, building upon other revelation. There's the cup of God's wrath in verse 16. So there's so many themes that are going to be picked up and discussed and then put back down in these Old Testament prophets. And then even in verses 18 through 19, we have what prophet is the graven image when its maker has engraved it, or a molten image, a teacher of lies? For its maker trusts in his own making, and when he fashions speechless idols, woe to him who says to a piece of wood, awake, to a mute stone, arise. And what that is your teacher? Behold, it is overlaid with gold and silver, and there is no breath at all inside it. Verse 20, but Yahweh is in his holy temple. Let all the earth be silent before him. And so it's kind of the Lord reaffirming what Habakkuk had initially spoken at the beginning of the chapter, that he's going to stand and wait for a response from the Lord. And the Lord says, yeah, that would be good. And not just you, but the whole earth should stand silent and wait. And so you have these 2 rounds of Habakkuk crying out to God and in confusion demanding answers, and then God's going to answer 2 times. And ultimately he's going to point and say, you need to sit silently and watch me work. That idolatry is going to be judged, and it will be addressed. And then chapter 3, we have Habakkuk's prayer. As he takes all of this in, he's going to process it, and then he's going to respond. And it's a very profound response that he gives. It's profound in a couple of different ways. We won't go through all of it because we have to make our way to Zephaniah. But in verses 1 and 2, you see a petition. It says, a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet according to Shigionoth. O Yahweh, I have heard the report about you, and I fear. And O Yahweh, revive your work in the midst of the years. And in the midst of the years, make it known. In rage, remember compassion. So Habakkuk is saying, God, when you come in judgment and you bring judgment upon Judah through the Babylonians, I understand that's going to come, but as you come and bring forth judgment, please also remember compassion. Don't leave compassion out of this equation. So he's appealing to the character of God and making that petition. And then in verses 3 through 15, he's going to be praising God for who God is and for how he operates in creation. And what's amazing is Habakkuk is really going to be building upon David's Psalms. So this is a tremendous passage to see that the Old Testament prophets, they knew the scriptures and they were building upon previous revelation as they wrote themselves, especially Psalm 18 and Psalm 68. Habakkuk is going to draw so much from those 2 particular psalms, and he's going to be echoing it in his own prayer. So he's echoing back to God as he prays to God. He's echoing back revelation. He's echoing back to God who he is and what he has done. And so at the beginning of verse 3, in this portion of praise in verses 3 to 15, the beginning of verse 3, you have God kind of arriving and coming onto the scene. And this is kind of portrayed almost as a theophany, as God appearing to Habakkuk. So at the beginning of verse 3, God arrives. God comes from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. And then his appearance is described in the remainder of verse 3 through verse 7. His splendor covers the heavens, and the earth is full of his praise. His brightness is like the sunlight, and he has rays flashing from his hand, and there is the hiding of his strength. Before him goes pestilence, and plague comes after him. He stood and measured out the earth, and looked and startled the nations. So the perpetual mountains were shattered, and the ancient hills collapsed. His ways are everlasting. I saw the tents of Cushan under wickedness, and the tent curtains of the land of Midian were trembling. And within this, it's almost like God is a giant, and he's going to be striding throughout the world and crushing his opponents. So then beginning in verse 8, we see God's acts in nature. Did Yahweh's fury burn against the rivers, or was your anger against the rivers, or was your anger, your wrath against the sea, that you rode on your horses, on your chariots of salvation? Your bow was made bare, rods were sworn unto battle by word. You split the earth with rivers, the mountains saw you and writhed. The downpour of waters passed by, the deep gave forth its voice. It lifted up its hands. Sun and moon stood in their lofty places, and they went away at the light of your arrows, at the brightness of your flashing spear. Then in verses 12 to 15, you're going to see how God also works among the nations. He says, in indignation you marched through the earth. In anger you trampled the nations. There's, again, that picture of God kind of stomping about the earth as a giant, just crushing with these strong nations. Babylon's coming up, and they're going to judge Judah. Yeah, God's going to crush them with his foot. That's kind of the picture of what we see here. You went forth for the salvation of your people, for salvation with your anointed. You crushed the head of the house of the wicked to lay him bare from thigh to neck. So there's multiple things taking place here, I think. Number one, what immediately jumps out to you? Who is your anointed? That term is never used to describe Israel. That is a messianic term used to describe the future coming king, the one who's going to bring about salvation. And then verse 13, the line right after that, says, you crushed the head of the house of the wicked. I think, yes, he's going to talk about, he could be speaking about in the past how there has been deliverance through Moses and through crushing of Pharaoh during the time of the Exodus. It could be referring to God crushing the king of Babylon, who's going to be, again, coming to judge Judah in the future. But as soon as you see that language, what also do we have to think about? You crushed the head. What does that remind us of? Yeah, Satan. And so as God is coming and judging and executing judgment upon wicked men on the earth, that's a foreshadowing of what? The promise of Genesis 3:15, that God will judge evil ultimately and finally when the anointed one crushes the head of the serpent. So there's so much happening here in this vision and in this prayer of Habakkuk. It says, you pierced with his own sharpened rods the head of his throngs. They stormed in to scatter us. Their exaltation was like those who devour the afflicted in secret. You tread on the sea with your horses and on the surge of many waters. So again, God is so big. He's treading and walking on the sea, and again, pictured as a warrior coming upon the earth. But then in verses 16 through 20, he says, I heard and my inward parts trembled. At the sound my lips tingled, decay entered my bones, and in my place I tremble, because I wait quietly for the day of distress, for the people to arise who will invade us. So Habakkuk is, again, circling back around and saying, okay, what Yahweh has promised I know is going to come about, and I'm going to rest in that, just like God told him to. But these last few verses are going to be resting in what God has promised, and Habakkuk himself is going to make a promise and a commitment to trust in Yahweh. Verse 17, though the fig tree should not blossom, and there be no produce on the vines, though the yield of the olive should fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock should be cut off from the fold, and there be no cattle in the stalls, yet I will exult in Yahweh. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. Yahweh, the Lord, is my strength, and he has made my feet like hinds' feet, and makes me tread on my high places. And again, this is so profound, because He's saying if everything crumbles, if there's no food in the land, if the trees aren't producing, if all of the cattle are destroyed and the land is just completely barren, Habakkuk is making a commitment to continue to trust in the Lord. If life is absolutely miserable for him, he says, I'm still going to trust. And because he understands that who is his strength? Talk to me, guys. Yahweh. Yahweh is his strength. If his strength is in all of those things, right? If your strength is in how much food you have in the cupboard and how secure you are in your home here on the earth, and those things are taken away, what are you going to feel? Unsettled. You're going to feel crushed and sad and depressed and all of those things. But when you realize Yahweh is your strength, then even in the middle of really difficult circumstances, you are able to feel like he describes in verse 19, which is building upon actually Psalm 18, verses 32 and 33. He's echoing what David said. So even as Habakkuk is looking at his own experience, he's building upon the promises and the truths that were given to David. And he says, hey, the Lord sustained David. He's also going to be able to sustain me. And again, building upon past faithfulness to encourage him in the present. So there's so much here, and this is so rich, and this is such a tremendous example of how the Old Testament authors knew and were building upon Old Testament scriptures that were previously written. And then one additional thought here concerning chapter 3 as a whole. Chapter 3 as a whole may change the way you read the Psalms. Okay, because how does chapter 3 begin? It says a prayer of Habakkuk according to the Shigionoth. So you have that kind of superscription, which we have in the Psalms. And how does it end? For the choir director on my stringed instruments. Now, somewhere along the way, that last line that we see here in Habakkuk, as the Psalms were compiled together, the last line of one psalm, I think, went down into the next psalm. So oftentimes you'll see at the beginning of a psalm in a superscription that, for the choir director on stringed instruments, that probably goes with the preceding psalm rather than where it is currently listed. So just something to think about. It's not a for sure thing, but from what we see and have mapped out here in Habakkuk, that may change a little bit of how you read the book of Psalms. So any questions, cries of shock, outrage on Habakkuk? Nothing. All right, let's move on to Zephaniah, and we'll kind of march through this quickly. So Zephaniah is going to have a lot of parallels and similarities to the book of Joel. The overall theme of Zephaniah is similar. So the book of Joel, the theme was the day of Yahweh, and the emphasis was on the first part of the book of Joel was the day of the Lord for Judah, and then the day of the Lord for the nations. Zephaniah is really going to emphasize the global judgment on the day of the Lord, and the purpose of to denounce the sin of Judah and the surrounding nations, and remind every nation that judgment is coming in the future day of Yahweh. And it was written by the prophet Zephaniah. And here's what's interesting. I think Zephaniah was royalty. And he may be the only Old Testament prophet who was royalty. If you look at the beginning of verse 1, the word of Yahweh which came to Zephaniah, the son of Cushai, the son of Gedaliah, the son of Amariah, the son of Hezekiah. You're like, wait, I know that name. That guy was a king. And so Zephaniah was royalty. I'm not sure how all of the royal houses of Judah were established and what you would call him. See, the son of a duke, that status of royalty and kind of being a part of the royal house probably was enabled him to be more heard. And so he prophesied during the time of Josiah. We see that in the very next lines in verse 1. In the days of Josiah, the son of Ammon, king of Judah. And he was probably prophesying earlier in Josiah's ministry prior to the book of the law being discovered and the reforms taking place in Judah. So it's probably somewhere between 640 and 630 that Zephaniah is writing. And you see that there in the author and date. And this book is going to have a larger front portion emphasizing a bad day of Yahweh. And then the last portion of chapter 3 is going to be a glad day of Yahweh. And again, this is following the pattern that we've seen so often in the minor prophets, right? The major themes in the minor prophets are God is going to bring judgment upon Israel and Judah for their sin. He's going to bring judgment upon the nations. But the final word for Israel and Judah is not going to be judgment. It's going to be blessing. And we're going to see that unfolding. As you also see on the chart there, an odd number of columns, right? And we've talked in the past about chiasms. And the emphasis being kind of in a Hebrew mindset, a way of emphasizing something is to work your way into an idea, and that's the destination point, and then you're going to work your way out in the text. And that's what we see here in the first portion of the book. We have in chapter 1, verses 1 through 3, we have judgment upon the whole earth. So we've already read verse 1 of chapter 1. Verse 2 says, I will completely end all things from the face of the ground, declares Yahweh. I will end man and beast. I will end the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea and the ruins along with the wicked, and I will cut off man from the face of the ground, declares Yahweh. Now that's a significant statement because if you think back to the creation order, what did God create last? Or who did God create last? Man, right? What did he create just before the men? The man and the woman. Yeah, the beasts and the birds and the fish. And so Zephaniah is beginning with man and then talking about what God is going to end. So really what Zephaniah is describing is an uncreation. He reverses the order in which God created in Genesis 1, and this is to emphasize, again, an earth-wide global judgment that's going to come. I will end man and beast. I will end the birds of the sky and the fish of the sea. So this is a severe judgment that God is going to bring, and this parallels chapter 3, verse 8. Again, those are the kind of the outsides of the chiasm. Chapter 3, verse 8, therefore wait for me, declares Yahweh, for the day when I rise up as a witness. Indeed, my judgment is to assemble nations, to gather kingdoms, to pour out on them my indignation and all my burning anger, for all the earth will be devoured by the fire of my zeal. Again, you see this judgment that's coming upon the earth, kind of on the outsides of this chiasm. And then one step in chapter 1, verse 4 through chapter 2, verse 3, you see judgment that's coming upon Judah. And what's profound in this portion is that he's going to condemn them for their idolatry. If you look at verses 4 through 6, look at how many references there are to some type of idolatry or false worship, or what we also talk about is syncretism. If you remember what that is, of taking a little bit of worship of the one true God and then sprinkling other things in. Let me take what's true and sprinkle in just a little bit of error, and then maybe I'll be okay. No, that doesn't work. And God's going to condemn them. Verse 4 says, so I will stretch out my hand against Judah and against all the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and I will cut off the remnant of Baal from this place, and the names of the idolatrous priests, along with the priests, and those who worship on the housetops, the host of heaven. And again, that's a kind of a pantheon of gods. And those who worship and swear to Yahweh. And if you just stop right there, it would be a really confusing verse, right? Wait, he's going to cut off those who worship and swear to Yahweh, but what's the end of the verse say? And yet swear by Milcom. So there's some who profess to worship and follow the one true God, and yet what are they also doing at the exact same time? They're worshiping other gods. So yes, there's an aspect of true worship, but it's diluted and polluted because they're also worshiping these idols as well. Verse 6, and those who turned back from following Yahweh, and those who have not sought Yahweh or inquired of him. And then beginning in verse 7, you're going to have this emphasis and these descriptions of the day of the Lord, the day of Yahweh. If you look at verse 8, It says, then it will be on the day of Yahweh's sacrifice. Verse 7, for the day of Yahweh, be silent before the Lord Yahweh, for the day of Yahweh is near. For Yahweh has prepared a sacrifice, and he has set apart his guests. So it's portraying that final day of judgment as God is making a sacrifice of the nations. Again, this is really severe judgment. In the pictures and the illustrations that are being used, again, you have an uncreation, you have God bringing sacrifices to himself and saying, the world I'm going to sacrifice in judgment because of their sin. Verse 9, and I will punish on that day all who leap on the temple threshold and who fill the house of their Lord with violence and deceit. Verse 10, and it will be in that day, declares Yahweh, that there will be the sound of a cry from the fish gate and a wail from the second quarter and a destruction from the hills. Wail, O inhabitants of the mortar, for all the people of Canaan will be silenced. All who weigh out silver will be cut off. And so again, just the description that he gives of the day of the Lord is sobering. It is intended to get their attention. And then verses 18 or 14 through 18, I think I read when we were doing kind of an overview of the minor prophets and the major themes, but this is such a clear, concise statement and a description of the future end-time event of the day of the Lord and God's judgment that's going to come as well. So near is the great day of Yahweh, near and coming very quickly. Oh, the sound, the day of Yahweh. In it the mighty man cries out bitterly. A day of fury is that day, a day of trouble and distress, a day of destruction and desolation, a day of darkness and thick darkness, a day of clouds and dense gloom, a day of trumpet and loud shouting against the fortified cities and the high corner towers. I will bring distress on men so that they will walk like the blind because they have sinned against Yahweh, and their blood will be poured out like dust and their flesh like dung, and neither their silver nor their gold will be able to deliver them on the day of the fury of Yahweh. And all the earth will be devoured in the fire of his jealousy, for he will make a complete destruction, indeed a terrifying one, of all the inhabitants of the earth. I guess if you were to say like different genres of the Old Testament books, how would we describe what we've read so far in Zephaniah? It's just like this is a get your attention, almost like a horror, like a shocking, like judgment is coming. Like this is so severe, and that's what it is intended to be. It's intended to get the attention not only of Judah but also of all of the nations. And you see the Lord promising judgment, and you also begin to see where are the New Testament apostles getting their understanding of end time events from the Old Testament. See, eschatology, the study of end times things, is not just a New Testament doctrine, it's an Old Testament doctrine. And they are, again, building upon what the prophets wrote. And you think about the themes that were picked up here in Zephaniah that were already spoken of back in Joel. If you turn back over to Joel chapter 2, we see all of these same themes being spoken of, and building upon another theme. What do you see in chapter 2 of Joel? Chapter 2, verse 1. What is Joel saying? Blow a trumpet. Right? Blow a trumpet in Zion. You see the same thing in chapter 2, verse 15. Blow a trumpet in Zion. You have these connections to trumpets. You have in chapter 2 of Joel, verses 30 through 32, and I will put wonders in the sky and on the earth, blood, fire, and columns of smoke. The sun will be turned into darkness and the moon into blood before the great and awesome day of Yahweh comes. And it will be on that day everyone who calls in the name of Yahweh will be delivered. For on Mount Zion and in Jerusalem there will be those who escape, as Yahweh has said, even among the survivors whom Yahweh calls. So again, there's this continuing thread of theology being built. And again, this is going to carry on beyond the minor prophets into the New Testament. And this is what we need to see. So we talked about chapter 1, verse 4 to chapter 2, verse 3. How does chapter 2, verses 1, 2, and 3, the end of that section of judgment upon Judah, you notice, what does God do in those last three verses of that section? So the beginning of chapter 2, again, he's going to call for them to repent. So there's these promises of judgment, but also still, hey, if you turn now, you will receive grace and compassion. Remember Habakkuk's prayer? In your wrath, remember what? Compassion. And that's exactly what God is continually promising of like, hey, if you're in sin, if you're wandering away from the Lord, what should you do right here, right now? Turn to him and trust in him. And he says, gather yourselves together, verse 1. Indeed, gather, O nation, without shame, before the decree takes effect. So before the judgment comes, before it comes into effect, turn. The day passes like chaff before the burning anger of Yahweh comes upon you. Before the day of Yahweh's anger comes upon you, seek Yahweh, all you humble of the earth, who have worked his justice. Seek righteousness, seek humility. Perhaps you will be hidden in the day of Yahweh's anger. So run to him. Again, the temptation is to, when we're in sin, to run away from God, but the only place of safety is actually running to him. And now, there's going to be a lot to echo that in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, where you're going to have not an emphasis specifically upon the nation of Judah, but more focused upon the city of Jerusalem. Chapter 3, verse 1, woe to her who is rebellious and defiled, the oppressive city. She did not listen to any voice. She did not receive discipline. She did not trust. She did not draw near to her God. So this condemnation of Jerusalem, what we see is that, did God just say, hey, they're disobeying and I'm going to immediately bring judgment upon them? No, he reasoned and pleaded and called out to them over and over and over again. Even, this just reminds me of Jesus when he's standing up and looking down upon the city of Jerusalem. What emotions does he feel as he looks at Jerusalem and they've rejected him? Is he standing there in anger? What's he doing? He's weeping and saying, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who rejected the prophets, right? The word of God came to them over and over and over again, but what was their response? They didn't listen. They wouldn't hear any voice, and they didn't receive discipline. And just that feeling of continually pursuing someone else and then having them ultimately cut you off, and your heart going out to them and pleading with them. That's the picture that we see here. In verse 3, her princes, notice all of these four categories, or in verses 3 and 4, you have two judgments or condemnations of a people group of leaders in the first two lines, and then a final statement in verse 3. Or the last line of each of these verses. Verse 3, her princes in her midst are roaring lions, and then her judges are wolves at evening. They leave nothing to gnaw for the morning. And then her prophets are reckless, treacherous men, and her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. And so there's a coupling and again a structure to those verses. And yet, despite all of that, Yahweh is righteous in her midst, and he will do no injustice. Every morning he brings justice to light. He does not fail. But the unjust knows no shame. I have cut off nations in their corners. Their corner towers are desolate, and I have made streets a waste with no one passing by. Their cities are laid waste, without a man, without an inhabitant. I said, surely you will fear me. Receive discipline. And so her abode will not be cut off, according to all that I have appointed concerning her. But they were eager to corrupt all their deeds. So even as God is promising restoration, they continue in their rebellion. And so that's kind of the next layer of the chiasm here. And then the center portion, the destination that Zephaniah is arriving at, is going to be found in chapter 2, verses 4 through 15, where it's pronouncing judgment upon the nations, and the nations will see and experience the wrath of God on that day of Yahweh, on the day of the Lord. And so he's driving into that point and then coming back out. But you also see that the judgment of Israel for their sins and ultimately upon the whole earth. But if you look at the beginning in verse 9 of chapter 3, this is a very powerful portion, because again, God's judgment of Israel and Judah. Previous scriptures, going back to Deuteronomy, where Moses is going to predict that Israel is going to fail miserably in everything that God has commanded them to do. And they're going to fail miserably because they don't have a heart. They need to be... They need a heart that is circumcised. They need a new heart. They need God to give them what they can't give to themselves. And they need a spiritual purification that they cannot attain in themselves. Notice how verse 9 begins, "For then I will change them to peoples with purified lips, that all of them may call on the name of Yahweh to serve him shoulder to shoulder." And so what God is promising in these verses is what Moses was saying that they needed. They needed to be fundamentally transformed. In that future end time event, after the Lord brings judgment upon the earth, he's also going to transform his people, Israel. From beyond the rivers of Ethiopia, verse 10, "My worshipers, my scattered ones, will bring my offerings. In that day you will feel no shame because of all your deeds by which you have transgressed against me. For then I will remove from your midst your proud, exalting ones, and you will never again be haughty on my holy mountain. But I will cause to remain in your midst a lowly and poor people, and they will take refuge in the name of Yahweh." So again, going back to Habakkuk's, making in Habakkuk 2, verse 4, he says, "The proud, their soul is not right within them, but the righteous will live by his faith." And that's almost a similar description to what Zephaniah is describing here. That there will be a poor and lowly people, a humble people, not a proud people, who will ultimately take refuge in the name of the Lord, and they will be saved. Verse 13, "The remnant of Israel will do no injustice and not speak falsehood, nor will a deceitful tongue be found in their mouths. For they will feed and lie down with no one to make them tremble." And then verses 14 through 20, you're going to have this promise of restoration. So verses 9 to 13 was a promise of conversion, that their hearts would be transformed, that they would look to Yahweh. 14 through 20 is going to be a promise of restoration. "Sing for joy, O daughter of Zion. Make a loud shout, O Israel. Be glad and exult with all your heart, O daughter of Jerusalem. Yahweh has taken away his judgments against you. He has cleared away your enemies." And then look at this. Again, think about Revelation as we read this last portion. Because Revelation ends with the people of God dwelling in heaven. And who is among them? The Lord. Their king, the king of Israel, Jesus, is there ruling and reigning among his people on the earth, on the new heavens and the new earth. What we see here, he has cleared away your enemies, verse 15, "And the king of Israel, Yahweh, is in your midst. You will fear evil no more. In that day it will be said to Jerusalem, 'Do not fear, O Zion. Do not let your hands fall limp. Yahweh your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. And he will be joyful over you with gladness, and he will be quiet in his love. He will rejoice over you with joyful singing.'" Now that's a powerful picture, right? Because how do we worship God here and now? What do? We echo back up to him. We rejoice in who he is and what he has done. But in that day in heaven, what is God going to be doing towards his people? He's going to be rejoicing over his people that he has saved, that he has redeemed. He's going to rejoice over us with singing, and specifically all of his redeemed, but especially Israel. Those whom he has called and saved from that nation, that remnant that he has preserved. He's going to rejoice over them with singing. Verse 18, "I will assemble those who grieve about the appointed feasts. They were from you, O Zion. The reproach of exile is a burden on them. Behold, I am going to deal at that time with all those who afflict you." So he's promising restoration and also promising justice, right? All of those who afflicted Israel and attacked them and abused them, he says, they will face the consequences from Yahweh. "And I will save the lame and gather the banished, and I will turn them in their shame into praise and a name in all the earth." At that time I will bring you in, even at the time when I gather you together. Indeed, I will give you to be a name and praise among all the peoples of the earth, when I restore your fortunes before your eyes, says Yahweh. And that's how the book ends. So that last word that God has for Israel is not ultimate judgment, but it's, I'm going to restore you. Again, all of those promises are from Deuteronomy are being reiterated, even as Israel has fulfilled what Moses said, and that they are rebelling and they're turning away from the Lord, even in the midst of that rebellion. It's easy for a parent to say ahead of time, well, if you were to sin and rebel against me and do something really horrible, I would still love you and care for you. It's good for a parent to say that hypothetically about the future, right? But when is that going to be put to the test? What was that? Yeah, when that son or daughter actually commits that sin, right? And when that happens, what is the son or daughter going to be worried about? Are mom and dad going to keep their word? Do they really mean what they have said? Right? And then as a father, as a mother, what are we going to be tempted to do in that moment? Well, I promised that, but they're really disrespectful. Maybe they deserve a little bit of, justice according to my standard. Right? There's that temptation. But here what we have, what Yahweh promised in earlier Revelation, we see coming to fruition, and then this is the situation. Right? If God was going to change his mind, now would be the time, right? But he doesn't say, I've changed my mind, time out, let me go back, let me reevaluate. I know I said that, but your sin was really big and really bad here, and I need to reconsider. And we can be thankful that God doesn't do that. He didn't do it with Israel, and he doesn't do it with us. And we have pictures of the gospel, that there's not I promise to forgive you and cleanse you. But your sin was really, really bad. And when I initially made those promises, I didn't think you would ever do something like this. He's not saying that. He's saying, no, my promises to you stand firm. And I will restore your fortunes. I will regather you, and I will give you a name and a praise. And again, even those promises are built upon other things within the Old Testament. But so those Old Testament books that we've been working our way through, right? Have you guys been praying against me in your prayers as I've forced you to read the minor prophets this month? I know some have, but there's actually so much theology here in the minor prophets and in the Old Testament. And they're not just little things, it's major threads that are throughout the Old Testament that are going to be picked up and continued to be built upon in the New Testament. So, any thoughts, clarifications, questions, outrage? Nothing? Anything? All right. Let me close this in prayer, and then we'll be ready for the worship service in a few minutes. Almighty God, you are the author of history, that you have created in 6 days at the beginning. You have given us life and breath and everything, and there is a day in the future when you will pour out your wrath and your judgment upon Israel and Judah and Jerusalem and the nations. Father, help us to realize the reality of future judgment that is coming upon the world according to your word. Help us to be convinced of that judgment, and may that rest heavily upon our hearts and our souls. But also, may your gospel relieve the fear and the dread. As it says in Romans, therefore there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And therefore we have peace with you because of who your Son is and what he has done on our behalf. He has saved us from that wrath to come, that we will not be participants on that day. We will never ever face your judgment, and for that we rejoice. But because we know so many in the world around us will face that judgment, please impress upon our hearts the need to go and proclaim even the message of the prophets, that judgment is coming, but if we turn to you in faith and trust in you, that you will have compassion and forgiveness upon us. Pray that you would impress all of these truths upon our hearts and use them to transform our minds and to loosen our tongues to go and proclaim the message of Jesus to those around us, all to your glory, honor, and praise. Amen. All right, you guys are dismissed, and we'll resume the worship service at 10:30.